They diverted the entire subdivision's drainage onto my land, so I opened the floodgates they forgot I owned. They rerouted the stormwater runoff from an entire subdivision, 47 homes, straight onto my land. They didn't ask. They didn't warn me. They didn't knock on my door, send a letter, make a phone call, or file a single document with my name on it. And when I finally understood the full scope of what they had done, when I stood at the edge of my lower field in rubber boots, ankle deep in water that had no business being there, watching brown foam churn around a fence post that had been dry for 30 years, I felt something settle in my chest. Not rage, not panic. Something quieter than that, and far more dangerous. Clarity. Because I had been doing my homework for weeks by then. I had been to the county recorder's office. I had sat with an engineer and an attorney. I had read documents that the people responsible for this flooding had never bothered to read, and I knew something they didn't. I knew that the infrastructure their entire drainage system depended on, the structure that controlled every drop of water that moved through this corridor, legally belonged to me. The floodgates were mine. They had just forgotten to check. I have lived on my land my entire adult life. Not the same house. The original farmhouse burned down in 1987, and my father rebuilt it 2 years later, a solid 4-bedroom with a wraparound porch that faces southeast and catches the morning light in a way that still makes me stop and appreciate it, even on bad days. But the land itself, 12 acres of gently rolling ground in the eastern part of Harlan County, has been in my family since 1961. My grandfather bought it for what would now seem like an impossible price, cleared the eastern section, put in the orchard, dug the pond, and raised my father on it. My father raised me the same way. When I took the deed in my own name, I made a promise to myself that I would understand every inch of what I was inheriting. Not just the sentimental geography, the old apple trees my grandfather planted, the hollow at the southeast corner that filled with water each winter and smelled like creek mud in the spring, but the legal and physical reality of the land, the property lines, the deed covenants, the recorded easements, the water rights. I took a surveying course at the community college. I read every document in the county file on my parcel. I talked to my neighbors. I knew my land the way a captain knows a ship, which is why, when things started going wrong, I noticed. The subdivision went up about 8 years ago. Creekside Meadows, they called it. 47 homes built on what had been the old Harrington horse farm to my northwest. The developer came in, graded the hills, put in roads and utilities, built the houses fast. I watched the construction from my upper pasture with the mixed feelings anyone has when open land becomes a neighborhood. Some genuine sadness, some pragmatic acceptance. Change comes everywhere. At least they left the old tree line along my border, which gave me some visual privacy. The subdivision sat higher than my land on the northwest side. That whole area tilts southeast, draining toward the low ground at my south boundary and beyond. That's just the topography. Water has always moved in that direction. In normal spring rains, the seasonal sheet flow came off that hillside, crossed the graded slope between our properties, and eventually found the old drainage channel that ran along the base of my property, fed the hollow, and dissipated into the soil and the watershed downstream. Normal, natural, nothing I'd ever had reason to worry about. The problem started 3 springs ago. March was wet. Not unusually so, just a normal wet March. But the flooding in my lower field was unlike anything I'd seen there. The water came fast, channeled, like something was pushing it rather than letting it spread. I thought it was a coincidence, a one-time event caused by that particular season's rain pattern. Then it happened in April. Then, after a hard rain in June. Then, in August. And August has never been a flooding month on this property in my lifetime. By the second spring, I had a serious problem. 6 weeks of standing water in my lower field. The ground turned boggy and stayed that way well into summer. My fence posts along that section rotted at the base and 2 sections collapsed. One of my mares pulled up lame after stepping in a submerged rut she couldn't see. 3 weeks of vet bills and rest stall time. The grass in that section died, replaced by the kind of reed grass that takes hold in wet ground and is nearly impossible to eradicate. I started watching the water more carefully, not just accepting it as weather, but actually observing it. Where it came from, how fast it moved, what direction it flowed. And that's when I noticed that it consistently came from the northwest, from the direction of the subdivision, and that it arrived in pulses, surges that correlated not with the intensity of rainfall, but with something else, something I couldn't yet identify. So I put on my boots one Saturday morning and walked the perimeter fence line, and that's when I found the first pipe. It was partially hidden by a stand of cedar trees that had grown up along the old fence. Volunteer cedars, the kind that take hold fast along fence lines and fill in within a few years. If I hadn't been specifically looking for something, I might have walked past it a dozen more times without registering what it was. A 24-inch corrugated concrete pipe, set into the earth at a deliberate downward angle, the opening flush with the ground surface on the uphill side and terminating 4 feet lower on my side of the fence line. The concrete collar around the opening was clean and unmottled. No weathering stain, no lichen, no sediment crust of the kind you'd expect on something installed more than 5 or 6 years ago. This pipe was recent. The interior, when I crouched and shone my phone flashlight into it, showed clear sediment tide lines, dark staining on the walls from repeated high-volume water flow, precisely the kind of marks left by a pipe that carries significant discharge on a regular basis. I straightened up and stood there for a moment, looking through the cedars toward the subdivision. From that spot, with the trees thinned by the angle of my view, I could see the backs of the houses on the western edge of the development, the clean graded slopes of their retention pond, and what I now recognized as a series of concrete drainage swales running along the rear property lines. Every swale aimed at this pipe. I took out my phone and photographed everything. The pipe opening, the cedar cover, the sightline back toward the development, the sediment marks inside, the ground disturbance around the concrete collar. 43 photographs in 15 minutes. Then I kept walking, and I found 2 more pipes. An 18-inch pipe near the northeast corner, tucked under the old fence line in a depression that had always seemed vaguely boggy. Now I understood why. And a 12-inch pipe buried in a culvert crossing on my access road, which had been there so long, or which I had seen so many times without really looking, that I'd never questioned it. But the outflow end was on my side and aimed directly down the slope into my lower pasture, and when I examined the concrete collar, the mix and finish were unmistakably modern. 3 pipes, all aimed at my land, all recently installed or recently modified, all carrying storm water from the direction of creekside meadows. I sat on the tailgate of my truck that afternoon with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything I'd found. Locations, sizes, observations, photographs, the date and time, the weather conditions. I am not a man who panics, and I am not a man who acts without thinking. But I recognized what I was looking at well enough to know that I needed to understand the full picture before I did anything. That night, I went back to my property files, the accordion folder I kept in the filing cabinet in the office, the one with every document related to this land going back to my grandfather's purchase, deed, survey plats, the one recorded easement for the power company's transmission line along the north boundary, tax records, the old water well permit, the septic system approval. I spread them on the kitchen table and started reading with fresh eyes, and that's when I found something I had looked at before but never truly understood. A single page attached to the original 1961 deed, and a pertinence agreement. I set it aside for the moment. I didn't yet know what it meant, but something about it made me keep going back to it as I read through everything else. I went to bed that night with the legal pad on the nightstand and my mind turning over what I'd seen. The flooding hadn't been weather. It hadn't been a natural shift in the water table. Someone had engineered this. Someone had deliberately redirected 47 homes worth of stormwater runoff through 3 pipes onto my property without my knowledge and without my consent. The question was, did they think I wouldn't notice? Or did they think I wouldn't matter? I was going to make sure they got a clear answer to both. Diane Holloway had been president of the Creekside Meadows HOA for 4 years, and in that time, she had developed the manner of someone who had stopped distinguishing between leading a community and owning it. I had met her 3 times before the morning I drove to her house. 3 times in 4 years, and every single interaction had been initiated by her, and every single one had involved her explaining to me, pleasantly, firmly, with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to people who don't immediately understand the obvious, what the HOA expected from adjacent properties. The first time had been about my fence. Too visible from 2 lots, she said, an aesthetic issue. She'd handed me a laminated card with the HOA's community standards. I had thanked her and closed my gate. The second time had been about a brush pile I'd created near the property line while clearing some deadfall. A fire hazard, she said, and possibly in violation of county ordinance. It was neither. I had checked, but I moved it anyway because moving it was easier than arguing about it. The third time she had knocked on my door to let me know that a dead tree near our shared fence line was a liability concern and that the HOA would appreciate its removal. I told her the tree was on my property and that I would address it when I chose to. She had smiled with all of her face, except her eyes, and told me she looked forward to that. What I had learned from those 3 encounters was this: Diane Holloway operated from an assumption of authority. She expected deference. She was accustomed to people who found it easier to comply than to push back. and she had interpreted years of small compliance, mine and everyone else's, as confirmation that she was in charge of her world and the edges of it. I drove to her house on a Tuesday morning, corner lot, the biggest in the western section. Her house faced a cul-de-sac, and its back fence bordered the largest of the development's retention ponds, a detail I noted with great interest as I pulled into her driveway. She answered the door in workout clothes, holding a ceramic mug with a Sao motivational quote on it, and if she was surprised to see me, she didn't show it. Mr. Calloway. She said it the way you'd say a neutral word, not warm, not hostile, measured. What can I do for you? Ms. Holloway, I said, I need to talk to you about the drainage situation on my lower property. I've found 3 stormwater discharge pipes directing water onto my land. I believe they're part of your development's stormwater management system. She tilted her head, just slightly, the practiced tilt of someone buying a half second to think while appearing to listen attentively. The stormwater system for Creekside Meadows, she said, was designed by a licensed engineering firm and approved by the county. It's fully compliant with all applicable regulations. I'm sure it is, I said. I'm not asking about compliance within your development. I'm asking about where the water goes after it leaves your development. Specifically, onto my land, through pipes I never authorized and for which I've received no compensation. Water follows natural topography, she said. The phrase was smooth, rehearsed sounding, the kind of thing you say when you've already spoken to a lawyer. There is a natural drainage corridor that has historically carried water from this elevation toward your property. That drainage pattern predates the development by decades. The natural drainage pattern, I said, keeping my voice calm and even, did not include a 24-inch concrete pipe with a clean concrete collar installed within the last 3 or 4 years. Natural drainage patterns don't have engineering stamps on them. Something happened in her expression then, not a crack. Diane Holloway did not crack easily, but a shift, a slight recalculation behind her eyes, the kind that happens when someone realizes the person they're talking to has done more homework than expected. Any improvements we made to the drainage infrastructure were done to manage stormwater responsibly and reduce uncontrolled runoff, she said. That benefits the entire area, including adjacent properties. Unmanaged sheet flow causes significantly more erosion and property impact than channel discharge. My lower field flooded for 6 consecutive weeks last spring, I said. My mare pulled up lame in the standing water. I lost 2 fence sections to soil saturation. In 30 years of living on this land, neither of those things had ever happened before. Last year was an unusually wet spring across the entire region. My upper field has the same weather as my lower field, I said. The upper field was fine. She took a slow sip of her coffee. Deliberate. A power move. The casual sip that says, I am not rattled by this conversation. Mr. Calloway, I want to be straightforward with you. Our community has 47 families. Those are homeowners with mortgages, children, property values they depend on. The stormwater system exists to protect them. Without it, we would face uncontrolled flooding within the development during storm events. The alternative to our current system is not a better outcome for you. It would simply mean the water moved through your property in a less organized way. Then pay me for the use of my property, I said simply. If your system depends on discharging onto my land, get a drainage easement. Compensate me for the permanent use of my ground. That's how property rights work. I'd have to refer that question to the HOA's legal counsel. Please do, I said. Phil Delaney, a board member I recognized from a county meeting I'd attended 2 years prior, appeared in the hallway behind Diane. He'd apparently been listening from inside. He stepped forward with his arms crossed, which I've always found is what people do when they want to look firm but haven't decided yet what to say. You do understand, he said, that what you're suggesting would cost this community a significant amount of money. Using someone's property without compensating them, I said, also costs money. It just costs the property owner instead of the user. I'm asking for the cost to be allocated correctly. Diane set her mug down on a side table near the door. We'll consult with our attorney and be in touch. I'd appreciate that, I said. I'll be doing my own research in the meantime. I wanted to have this conversation with you directly first, as a courtesy. We appreciate that, she said, with the particular tone that means we appreciate nothing about this. She closed the door. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before I started the engine. I was trying to read the temperature of that conversation accurately, without optimism or pessimism. What I had read was this. She wasn't afraid. She was annoyed, and she was calculating, but she wasn't afraid. That told me she felt secure in her position, secure enough to dismiss rather than negotiate. That security was going to be a problem for her because it was built on the assumption that she understood the full legal picture, and she didn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if her lawyer was doing the same superficial review her engineers had apparently done. What she didn't know, what nobody in that HOA boardroom knew, was that I had already found something in my deed file that changed the entire geometry of this situation. And in the days ahead, I was going to understand exactly what I was holding. My father used to say that most people lose legal disputes not because they have the weaker case, but because they stop looking before they find the strongest part of it. He wasn't a lawyer either. He was a man who had fought a boundary dispute with a neighbor in 1991 and won it because he'd spent 4 months in the county records office while the neighbor had spent 4 months hiring attorneys to bluster. The paper, he always said, tells the truth. People don't. I thought about that a lot during the 3 weeks I spent investigating. My first stop was the Harlan County Recorder's Office, which occupied the east wing of the courthouse building and smelled of old paper and the particular institutional coffee that government offices have served since approximately 1974. The clerk's name was Gerald Mims. He was a quiet, thin man in his late 50s who wore the same brand of reading glasses every day and who had, over 22 years in that office, developed the ability to locate any document in the county's filing system with the same unhurried certainty that a librarian uses to pull a book from a shelf they've memorized. I told Gerald what I needed, the complete property file for my parcel, going back to the original conveyance, and the complete development file for Creekside Meadows, the subdivision plat, the stormwater management plan, the construction permits, any amendments or modifications to the drainage system filed after initial approval. He told me it would take 3 days. 3 days later, I picked up 2 large envelopes and brought them home. I spread the Creekside Meadows documents on the kitchen table first. The stormwater management plan was a thick document, 42 pages plus engineering drawings, produced by a firm called Hendricks and Associates. I have no engineering background, but I know how to read a technical document, and I read this one slowly, page by page, cross-referencing the drawings with the text. The system was what Diane had described, a network of collection swales, 3 interconnected retention ponds, and a downstream conveyance structure that discharged into what the plan called Existing Natural Drainage Channel SE1. The retention ponds held water during storm events and released it at a controlled rate through the channel, which carried it southeast to what the plan identified as Regional Retention Facility Basin R7. I pulled out my parcel map. Basin R7 was the hollow at the southeast corner of my property, not adjacent to my land, not in the general vicinity. Within the deeded boundaries of my 12 acres, inside the property line I had walked and surveyed and knew by memory, their entire system discharged into a basin on my land. I read that page 3 times. I looked at the map 3 times. There was no question about it. And then I looked for the easement, the legal, their baratsa, document that would grant them the right to use my property as their discharge point. I looked through every page of the stormwater plan. I looked through the construction permit. I looked through the subdivision plat. I looked through the county approval records. There was no easement. Not a recorded one, not a pending application, not even a footnote acknowledging that the discharge basin was on private property. The engineering plan simply assumed access to Basin R7 as though it were a public facility, as though nobody owned it, as though a private piece of land could be conscripted into service as infrastructure for a 47-home development without so much as a phone call to the person who paid the property taxes on it. I wrote that down on my legal pad and underlined it twice. Then I opened the envelope with my property file and started reading from the beginning. The 1961 deed was a standard warranty deed, well preserved, the typeface slightly faded but legible. The property description, the consideration paid, my grandfather's name and signature, the notary seal. Standard in every way, except for the attachment, a single typed page, paperclipped to the back of the deed, notarized separately. I had seen it before. I had seen it every time I'd gone through this file, but I had never read it carefully, the way you read something when you're looking for something. I read it carefully now. Appurtenance agreement and water control rights. Drainage infrastructure, Harlan County Rural District 4. This agreement is entered into between Harlan County, acting through its Board of Commissioners, and the owner of the hereinafter described real property as follows. In 1959, 2 years before my grandfather's purchase, the county had constructed a regional stormwater management system for Rural District 4. The system included, at the head of the drainage channel that ran through my property, a water control structure, a set of adjustable vertical slide gates set into a concrete headwall designed to regulate the flow of water from the upland areas through the channel and into the low basin during high water events. The structure had been built on what was then publicly owned land. When the county conveyed that land to my grandfather in 1961, the appurtenance agreement transferred with the deed. The water control structure, the physical gates, and the documented right to operate them had passed to my grandfather as an appurtenance to the property, meaning the floodgates were part of the land. They came with it. They had passed to my father and then to me through the chain of title. I read the document 4 times. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The people who designed the Creekside Meadows drainage system had identified my hollow as their terminal discharge facility. They had built their entire stormwater infrastructure around the assumption that water would flow freely through the channel and into that hollow. But the flow of water through that channel was regulated, legally, operationally, by right, by a water control structure that belonged to me. Their system didn't just discharge onto my land. It depended on infrastructure I owned. If I closed those gates, the channel would back up. The retention ponds would have nowhere to drain. In a significant rain event, they would overflow. The floodgates weren't just my property. They were the keystone of their entire system, and they had never checked who held the key. I called a civil engineer the next morning. Marcus Webb drove a mud-splattered F-250 and wore the same brand of khaki work pants every time I saw him, which told me he was either very organized or didn't think much about clothing, both of which I take as good signs in an engineer. He'd been in civil and hydraulic engineering for 26 years, 10 with the State Highway Department, 8 at a large private firm that did mostly municipal drainage projects, and the last 8 running his own consultancy out of a 2-room office above a hardware store in the next county over. His referral had come from Patricia Okafor, the land attorney I'd contacted the same week. Patricia Okafor practiced out of a 4th-floor corner office and had the manner of someone who had learned, over 2 decades of property litigation, that the most important thing in any legal dispute is the quality of your documentation. She had reviewed my deed file and the HOA's engineering documents before I met with Marcus, and her preliminary assessment had been characteristically measured. You may have a very strong position, but I want an engineer on the ground before we make any formal claims. What the documents say and what the ground says sometimes diverge. Let's find out. Marcus spent 2 full days on my property. He walked the entire drainage path from the subdivision boundary to the hollow. He took elevation measurements at 20-meter intervals, which gave him a precise picture of the topography and the flow gradient. He photographed each pipe outlet, took sample measurements of the pipe diameters, and documented the sediment patterns that indicated historical flow volumes. He walked the old drainage channel from end to end, clearing vegetation as he went, noting the width, the bank heights, the condition of the channel bed, and he found the water control structure. It was about 200 yards from the northeast corner of my property, where the channel curved slightly before heading south. Over the years, decades really, vegetation had grown up around the concrete headwall, and the whole structure had become half buried in accumulated soil and leaf matter. I'd known it was there in the vague way you know about every old piece of infrastructure on a property you've owned for years. It registered as a feature of the landscape, not as something with particular significance, a relic. I had never thought about what it did or what it was worth. Marcus cleared the vegetation back with a machete and spent an hour examining the structure with the focused attention of someone reading a language I don't speak fluently. Then he walked back to where I was standing and said, in his dry, precise way, "This is a county standard Type 3 water control structure circa late 1950s. 2 vertical slide gates, each 36 inches wide, set in a reinforced concrete head wall. The operating rods are threaded steel, hand-operated. One is intact, the other has a fracture in the upper coupling that's been there a long time, probably from freeze-thaw cycling, but it's repairable. The concrete head wall is structurally sound. I'd give this thing another 50 years without major work." "Can it be operated?" I asked. "With some mechanical work, yes. The gate seals look intact. Someone who knew what they were doing could have this thing fully functional in 3 or 4 days." I handed him the appurtenance agreement. He read it standing in the field, holding the photocopy with both hands the way people hold documents when they're reading carefully. "Okay," he said. "This changes things considerably." We spread a topographic map on the tailgate of his truck. He walked me through the hydraulics of the situation with the patience of a teacher. "Here is what Hendricks built," he said, tracing with his finger. "They took all impervious surface from the development, rooftops, driveways, streets, hardscaped areas, and directed that runoff into collection swales. The swales drain to 3 interconnected retention ponds. The ponds fill during storm events and release at a controlled rate through those pipes you found, down through the drainage channel, and into your hollow. Your hollow holds the water. The soil absorbs it over time, and the excess filters into the downstream watershed. How dependent is their system on free flow through the channel? Completely." he said, without hesitation. The downstream conveyance through that channel is the only outflow pathway for their entire stormwater infrastructure. There is no secondary outlet, no overflow bypass, no alternative discharge route. If the channel is blocked, or if flow is restricted, the retention ponds have nowhere to go. What happens to them in a significant storm? He calculated for a moment. In a 2-inch per hour rainfall event, call it a moderate to heavy storm, their system receives approximately 850,000 gallons of inflow over an 8-hour period. Their combined pond capacity is approximately 1.2 million gallons. Under normal operating conditions with free outflow, the ponds cycle through that volume without topping out. With the gates fully closed and no outflow, he paused, the ponds would reach capacity in approximately 6 hours of peak rainfall. After that, they overflow their containment berms. And the overflow goes where? It follows the topography. The lowest ground in the western section of the development is the rear yards along the back fence. The primary overflow path would be westward along the rear lot line and then northward into the street drainage system, which also has limited capacity. You'd have standing water in the rear yards within hours, deep water in the lowest lying streets within 12 hours. I took that in. Now, Marcus said, with the careful tone I'd already learned to recognize, the tone that means I'm about to give you important advice about how to use this information responsibly. You have an unambiguous legal right to operate those gates. The appurtenance agreement is clear, but how you exercise that right matters enormously. There's a difference between managing your own drainage infrastructure and weaponizing it. I'd recommend a documented, methodical approach, formal notice, legal counsel involved at every step. The goal should be forcing a negotiated resolution, not just causing damage. That's exactly my goal, I said. I want them to either pay me for a proper easement or redesign their system so it doesn't depend on my land. What I'm prepared to do, if they refuse both options, is demonstrate what their refusal actually means. Marcus nodded slowly. Then, let me be your engineer of record on this. I'll document everything. When this ends up in a courtroom, and it will end up somewhere official, you want a paper trail that shows you acted reasonably, transparently, and within your rights. That's what I want, I said. Patricia Okafor, when I met with her the following week, used a phrase I've thought about many times since. She said, "They built a house of cards on your foundation. They just don't know it yet." She had reviewed everything: the deed history, the appurtenance agreement, the HOA's engineering plans, the county permit records, the complete documentation Marcus had produced. She had also, on her own initiative, pulled the HOA's corporate filings, the developer's original construction permits, and the county drainage approval correspondence. What they did is not uncommon, she said. Engineers designing drainage systems routinely utilize existing natural features, channels, basins, wetlands, as terminal discharge points. The problem is that they frequently assess only zoning and environmental status, not full deed history. This firm identified your hollow as a regional retention basin, noted its drainage function, and assumed it was available for use. They never checked the 1961 deed attachment. Does the HOA know about the appurtenance agreement? I asked. I would be surprised, she said. It's recorded, but not prominently. It's a single-page attachment on a 60-year-old deed. Without a full title search going back to the original conveyance, you'd miss it. Their engineers did a standard easement search, not a full title search. The HOA board relies on its engineers, and Diane Holloway is a residential real estate agent. She's comfortable with standard property documents, not with 60-year-old appurtenance agreements tied to rural county infrastructure. So she's operating blind. She believes she has the stronger position, Patricia said. She may have even consulted with her attorney about a first-level review of your complaint, but I guarantee you that attorney has not read this appurtenance agreement. She sent the demand letter 2 days later. The demand letter was 4 pages long, and it was, in the precise, calibrated language of property law, a demolition of the HOA's position. Patricia Okafor did not write angry letters. She wrote accurate ones, which are considerably more effective. The letter set out in sequence: the unauthorized discharge of storm water onto my property through 3 installed pipes, the identification of Basin R7, my hollow, as the terminal facility in the Creekside Meadows Stormwater Management Plan without any recorded easement or compensation, the appurtenance agreement, and the chain of title that established my ownership and operational right over the water control structure at the head of the drainage channel, and the legal analysis concluding that the HOA had constructed and operated a stormwater system entirely dependent on my private infrastructure without legal authorization. It made 2 demands. First, negotiate and execute a compensated drainage easement within 30 days. Second, if no easement was agreed upon, present a certified engineering plan for an alternative drainage solution within the same 30 days. And it contained one notice. That absent resolution on either front, I intended to exercise my legal right to operate the water control structure, effective at the close of the 30-day window. The letter was sent by certified mail, return receipt requested, addressed to Diane Holloway as HOA president and to the HOA's registered agent. I know it arrived on a Thursday because the return receipt came back signed the following Monday. The HOA's response came not from Diane, but from a law firm, Mercer, Bass, and Hollingsworth. Large firm, glass lobby, the kind of address that's meant to communicate that you are now dealing with serious people. Their attorney was named Garrett. I never learned his first name. Patricia always referred to him as Garrett, and he called Patricia 3 days after the letter arrived. His position: the drainage system had been built in good faith by a licensed engineering firm. It held all applicable county permits. Natural drainage law in the state established that landowners in lower elevation positions accepted natural water flow from higher ground, and my client had no legal basis to interfere with a permitted stormwater system. Furthermore, any attempt to restrict water flow in a manner that damaged HOA property would constitute intentional tortious interference, and my client would face significant liability. Patricia's response: produce the drainage easement or the clock was still running. They did not produce an easement. 10 days into the 30-day window, Diane Holloway drove to my workshop. I was rebuilding a tractor carburetor when I heard the Audi in the driveway. I finished what I was doing, wiped my hands, and came outside. She had Phil Delaney with her again. He seemed to serve as a kind of witness or reinforcement, the way some people bring backup to difficult conversations because they're not quite confident enough to have them alone. She was dressed for authority: blazer, pressed slacks, low heels that were impractical for a gravel driveway. Her posture was straight and her expression was composed. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this. "I'd like to speak with you directly," she said, "rather than through attorneys." "Any negotiation needs to go through my attorney," I said. "That's not a personal preference. It's how legal disputes work. I understand that. But I think there are things that get lost between lawyers that might be better said person to person." I leaned against the workshop door frame and waited. "Our community is 47 families," she said. Her voice was measured, careful. "Real people. Homeowners who bought in good faith, who have children in school here, who are just trying to live their lives. They didn't make the drainage decisions. They don't know the engineering details. They're just people who own homes in a neighborhood, and the action you're threatening, the consequences you're describing, those fall on them, not on the board, not on the developer who built this, not on the engineers who designed it, on them. I'll give her this. It was well constructed. The appeal to innocent third parties, the shift of moral weight from the institution that had wronged me to the individuals who lived within it." She'd thought about this argument. It had real rhetorical force. "Ms. Holloway," I said, "I have no interest in harming anyone. My interest is in being compensated fairly for the use of my property. That's it. If the HOA needs to discharge stormwater onto my land in perpetuity, I should be paid for that right. That's a reasonable position. I've made it in a formal legal demand. The response from your attorneys was to deny my rights and threaten me with liability. So here we are." "The amount your attorney is asking is not reasonable," she said. "We had an independent appraisal." "In 10 days, I said. She paused. "We moved quickly because we take this seriously." "The appraisal," I said, "should go to my attorney. That's the conversation I'm asking you to have." Phil Delaney uncrossed his arms and crossed them again. "If you close those gates and there's flooding in this neighborhood, you will be sued. You understand that?" "I understand that your attorneys have threatened that," I said. "My attorney has a different analysis. Courts are how you find out who's right." "You're willing to put 47 families through that?" Diane said. "The 47 families are in this situation," I said, "because the developer who built your neighborhood and the HOA board that has managed it never secured the legal right to use my property. I didn't create this problem. I'm offering a path to resolving it. The path requires money. If the HOA would rather spend that money on litigation, that's a choice your board is making." They left. I watched the Audi back down my driveway and felt the particular quiet that follows a conversation you've been expecting and prepared for. I had said everything I needed to say. There was nothing left to negotiate verbally. What neither of them knew, what I had said nothing about, shown nothing of, was that while their attorneys were drafting legal briefs and Diane was rehearsing speeches, I had already been moving. Marcus Webb had brought in a structural specialist named Ray Kowalski, who had spent 30 years maintaining county water infrastructure before retiring to do private consulting. Ray had examined the floodgate structure for 2 days and pronounced it, in his unadorned way, solid. Old, but solid. They built this stuff right back then. You need the upper coupling on the east rod replaced, the gate seals need to be reseated, and both operating mechanisms need to be cleaned and greased. 4 days of work. After that, this thing runs like it was installed last year. I had hired Ray and his assistant on the spot. They worked quietly, tucked back in the vegetation at the far end of my property. From the road, from the subdivision, from anywhere a casual observer might look, there was nothing to see. Just 2 men doing maintenance work on a private drainage structure on private land, which is exactly what it was, and exactly how I wanted it characterized. The gates were fully restored and operational on a Thursday. The demand letter had been received the previous Thursday. I had 20 days left in the 30-day window, and I had fully functional floodgates. Marcus walked the system one more time after the restoration. He checked the gate seals, verified the operating rods, tested the gates through a partial open-close cycle to confirm smooth operation. Then he took a full set of date-stamped, geotagged photographs. Both gates in the open position, both gates in the closed position, the surrounding channel conditions, the entire structure, documentation, everything documented. The 30-day window closed on a Friday. The HOA's legal response, 40 pages, delivered by Garrett, who clearly billed by the page, argued a pertinent rights ambiguity, natural drainage supremacy, tortious interference exposure, and emergency injunction threat. Patricia read it over the weekend and summarized it for me on Monday morning. They're throwing everything at the wall. None of it changes the core analysis. She filed a response, 10 pages. Surgical. Her final line, proceed as planned. The weather forecast for the following Friday called for 2 to 3 inches of rain over 18 hours. I called Marcus. He told me what I already knew. This was the storm. The National Weather Service issued its updated forecast on Wednesday afternoon. A slow-moving, low-pressure system tracking in from the southwest, expected to arrive Friday evening and persist through Saturday morning. Projected rainfall for Harlan County, 2 to 3 inches, with isolated amounts up to 3.5 inches possible in the higher elevations. The rainfall rate during the peak window, Friday night into early Saturday, was projected at 3/4 to 1 inch per hour. Marcus and I had modeled this kind of event weeks earlier. At 1 inch per hour across the Creekside Meadows watershed, their system would receive approximately 850,000 gallons of inflow over an 8-hour peak period. With free drainage through the channel and into the hollow, the retention ponds would cycle normally, elevated but within design parameters. With the gates closed and no outlet, the ponds would reach their combined capacity of 1.2 million gallons in approximately 6 hours of sustained peak inflow. After that, the water had to go somewhere. I called Patricia on Wednesday evening. The forecast is Friday, I said. I want to close the gates. Before you do, she said, I need you to give them one more formal notice, written to their attorney of record. You intend to exercise your operational rights over the water control structure beginning Thursday at noon. That gives them 24 hours. Why? I asked. We already sent the demand letter. We already gave 30 days. Because every step of this needs to be bulletproof, she said. I want a documented record showing that you gave them adequate notice at every stage and that at every stage they chose legal resistance over resolution. When this is in front of a judge, and it will be, I want the timeline to speak for itself. She sent the notice Thursday morning. It was a single page. Clear, precise, professional. My client intends to exercise operational control over the water control structure on his property beginning Thursday, November 14th at noon. No injunction is currently in effect. This notice is provided as a courtesy. At 9:47 a.m., Garrett called Patricia. They had filed for an emergency temporary restraining order in county court. A judge would hear the motion that afternoon. I drove to the county seat and sat in the back of a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled of old carpet and read my phone while Patricia argued our position in front of a judge I'd never seen before, a woman in her late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the measured efficiency of someone who had heard every argument and didn't need any of them padded. The HOA's attorney argued irreparable harm, innocent homeowners, emergency circumstances, a residential neighborhood at risk from a neighbor acting in bad faith. Patricia argued documented property rights, 30-day formal notice ignored, no easement on record, no legal authority restricting my operational rights on my own property. The judge asked 3 questions. She asked Garrett whether there was a recorded easement authorizing the HOA's use of the drainage channel and hollow. He said there was not a recorded easement, but that natural drainage law superseded private control rights. She asked him to identify the statute. He cited a case. Patricia distinguished it in 30 seconds. The judge asked no more questions. She denied the TRO. Her words, as Patricia read them to me from the transcript later: the applicant has not demonstrated a substantial likelihood of success on the merits. The respondent's documented property rights appear facially valid, and the applicant had adequate notice and opportunity to negotiate. Emergency relief is not appropriate where the emergency is of the applicant's own making. I read that sentence several times. I called Marcus from the courthouse parking lot. "Tonight," I said, "before the storm." We met at the gate structure at 8 o'clock. The sky was already moving. Thick clouds coming from the southwest. A warm, restless wind with the particular electric charge that precedes serious rain. The kind of night that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Marcus and Ray Kowalski were both there. Marcus was photographing. Ray was handling the mechanical operation. I stood to one side and watched. The gates were 2 vertical steel panels, each 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, fitted into a concrete sill with a rubber gasket seal along the bottom edge. The threaded operating rods ran up through the concrete headwall and terminated in T-bar handles at surface level. After Ray's restoration work, they turned smoothly, with a low metallic sound that was somehow satisfying, the sound of something built to do a job doing its job. Ray turned the east rod first, slow even turns, and the east gate descended into the channel. The gap between gate and sill narrowed. The light from Marcus's work lamp caught the water in the channel, moving slowly in its current. And then, as the gate came down, the current slowed. The water upstream began to back up slightly, rising against the gate face. Then, the west gate. Same deliberate turning, same slow descent, the gate seeding into the sill with a low, final sound. The channel downstream of the gates went still. The upstream water level began to rise, slowly and visibly, pooling behind the concrete headwall. Marcus took photographs of both gates in the closed position, the backed up water, the surrounding area, timestamps, GPS coordinates, documentation. I had a notarized log of the gate closure that Ray and I both signed, with the time recorded as 8:31 p.m. We were back at our trucks by 8:50. The rain began at 11:15 p.m. I know because I was awake. I'm always awake before a storm on this property. Habit maybe, or something older than habit. I lay in bed and listened to the first drops on the roof, the irregular patter that builds slowly into something steadier, and then steadier than that, until by midnight it was drumming on the tin roof of the workshop, and I could hear the gutters filling and the downspouts working hard. My phone buzzed at 2:47 a.m., missed call from an unknown number. At 3:11 a.m., another. By the time I got up at 6, there were 14 missed calls from 3 different numbers I didn't recognize. I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window and looked out at a gray, waterlogged morning. My upper field was fine, wet, but draining normally. My lower field, now protected by the closed gates, was handling the runoff correctly for the first time in 3 years, the water moving through the established pathways rather than pooling. I drove to the north fence line after 7. The rain had slowed to a steady, moderate fall, and from the high ground I had a clear view across the subdivision. What I saw was something I had modeled in my mind for weeks, something Marcus had described in precise hydraulic terms, but seeing it in reality was different. The retention pond behind the western lots was full. I could see that even from my fence line, the surface was high, very close to the containment berm, and with the rain still falling, there was nowhere for it to go. The swales that should have been draining into the pond were now backing up, water sheeting across rear yards that weren't designed to carry surface flow. At 8:22 a.m., I saw the berm fail, not catastrophically. There was no wall of water, no dramatic collapse. The lowest section of the earthen berm saturated and softened. The water found the weak point, and it came over in a spreading sheet. Within 20 minutes, the flow had cut a channel through the berm and was running steadily across the rear yards of the western lots. By 9 a.m., it had reached the rear fence lines. By 9:30, the lowest streets in the development had water running several inches deep across the pavement. I could hear sirens from where I stood. A fire department vehicle rolled slowly through the development, lights going. I could see, distantly, people standing in their driveways, looking at the water in their yards. My phone rang. Garrett. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 47 seconds long. Legal threats, demands to open the gates immediately, the word emergency used 4 times, the phrase, "you will be held personally liable," twice. Underneath the professional vocabulary was something that sounded very much like fear. I forwarded it to Patricia and called her. "Don't respond," she said immediately. "Don't open the gates. Not until we hear from the County Emergency Management Office, and not until I tell you." At 11:28 a.m., I received a call from Dave Sutter, the County Emergency Management Coordinator. Professional, calm, clear. He identified himself, described the situation, and asked me to explain the legal basis for the gate closure. I told him my attorney would call him directly and gave him Patricia's number. Patricia called him within 4 minutes and sent him, by email in the next 15, the complete documentation package, the appurtenance agreement, the full deed history, the demand letter, the 30-day response record, the TRO motion and denial from the previous afternoon, and Marcus Webb's engineering report. Patricia told me later that there was a long pause after he finished reviewing the documents. Then he said, "I see. This changes my understanding of the situation considerably. I opened the gates at 2:15 p.m., not under legal compulsion, by choice. The storm had peaked and was tapering. The primary rainfall event was over. Patricia and I had agreed that the point had been made. The documentation was complete, the damage was witnessed and photographed by dozens of people and by county emergency personnel, and there was nothing to gain from prolonging the restriction. I had exercised my rights. I had done so with complete documentation and prior notice. The consequences were the consequences of their choices, not mine." Ray Kowalski met me at the gate structure at 2:10. He turned the operating rods with the same methodical care as the night before. The gates rose. The backed-up water moved through immediately, a surge of brown-gray flow that filled the channel to its banks and moved south toward the hollow at the highest rate I'd ever seen in that channel. Within 4 hours, the subdivision streets were largely clear. The damage assessment, compiled over the following 2 weeks by insurance adjusters, water intrusion into 3 garages, standing water in 2 finished basements to depths of 4 to 6 inches, the complete failure of the Western Retention Ponds containment berm requiring full reconstruction, destruction of landscaping along multiple drainage swales, and partial collapse of 4 rear yard fences under sustained water pressure. Total assessed damage, $231,000. Not one drop of floodwater had touched my land. The county engineering department opened its investigation on the Monday following the flood event. The inquiry was formal. A written notice to the HOA, copied to the engineering firm Hendricks and Associates, advising that the department was reviewing the Creekside Meadows stormwater management system for potential deficiencies in the permitted design and as-built conditions. The lead investigator was a senior drainage engineer named Dr. Eleanor Kim, who had been with the department for 17 years and who had the particular quality of people who have spent decades looking at what water does when people try to manage it. She was patient, thorough, and she did not accept assumptions as facts. She reviewed the original permit application, the approved plans, the as-built documentation, and the events of the flood. She interviewed Marcus Webb. She reviewed the appurtenance agreement. She walked the property. Her report took 6 weeks. It was 12 pages long. It was, in the careful, qualified language of governmental technical reports, devastating. The Hendricks and Associates Stormwater Management Plan, the report concluded, had identified Basin R7 as the terminal discharge facility for the system, but had not conducted a full deed history search to determine ownership and legal status of the water control infrastructure associated with that basin. The plan had assumed availability of private infrastructure without documented authorization. The county's permit review process had not caught this omission because the permit application had not disclosed the existence of the private water control structure. Had it been disclosed, the permit would have required documented easement agreements as a condition of approval. The permits were retroactively conditioned. The HOA now had 90 days to either produce a recorded drainage easement from me or submit a certified alternative drainage plan, demonstrating that the system could function without depending on my infrastructure. If neither condition was met, the stormwater management permits would be revoked, which would place every home in the development and technical violation of its stormwater management requirements. A status with serious implications for property sales, refinancing, and insurance. I received a phone call from a different attorney the day after the county's report was released. Her name was Susan Falk, and she had clearly been hired specifically to fix this situation rather than continue fighting it. She did not introduce herself as HOA counsel. She introduced herself as a resolution specialist, which I found admirably honest. Her first words to Patricia, according to Patricia's account, were, "My client needs to resolve this. What does yours want?" Patricia presented the easement valuation package Marcus and I had prepared. A permanent drainage easement for controlled discharge through the channel and into the hollow at defined maximum flow rates, with my right to operate the floodgates retained in full. with monitoring infrastructure to be installed at the HOA's expense, and with a right of first refusal in the event the HOA sought to expand discharge capacity. The compensation figure, $165,000. Susan Falk said she would be back within 48 hours. She came back in 36. The HOA board had met in emergency session. They had received, simultaneously with the county's report, preliminary estimates from two engineering firms for what an alternative drainage solution would require, rerouting the system's discharge to the county stormwater main on the north side of the development, which would involve significant excavation, new piping, and a pump station to overcome the elevation difference. The lower of the two estimates was $430,000. The higher was $510,000. Neither figure included the cost of the ongoing county permit negotiations, the engineering fees for the alternative design, or the legal fees already incurred. They accepted my number. The easement agreement was executed 4 weeks later, $165,000, wired directly to my account on the day of signing. A permanent, limited drainage easement granting the HOA the right to discharge stormwater through the channel and into the hollow at defined maximum flow rates, contingent on my continued ownership and operational control of the water control structure. I was required to operate the gates in a reasonable and non-arbitrary manner, consistent with standard water management practices. I was not required to keep them open at any specified time. I was not required to notify the HOA before adjustment during normal maintenance operations. I was not liable for consequences of their drainage system's design limitations during gate operation within the documented parameters. Patricia had negotiated that last clause for 3 days. I told her to hold on it. She held. They conceded. But the story had one more chapter, and it came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. The county's investigation had a secondary phase, not into the drainage system itself, but into the HOA board's governance. Specifically, whether the board had acted within its fiduciary duty to homeowners when it chose legal resistance over negotiation, and whether there had been any failure to disclose material information to the homeowners whose property and finances were affected by the dispute. This phase was triggered by 3 separate homeowner complaints filed in the weeks after the flood. 3 residents whose basements had taken on water, who had read the coverage in the county paper, who had learned that the HOA had known for 30 days that their drainage situation was a contested legal matter, and who had not been told a word about it. The HOA's own documents were subpoenaed as part of a civil action filed by 2 of the affected homeowners. Email correspondence between Diane Holloway and the engineering firm. Board meeting minutes from executive sessions held during the 30-day demand period. Internal communications with Mercer, Bass, and Hollingsworth. What those documents revealed emerged gradually over the course of about 3 months through the discovery process. I learned most of it secondhand through Patricia, who was following the civil action closely. 10 days before the 30-day window on my demand letter closed, while Garrett was filing legal briefs about natural drainage law, a board member named Kevin Strauss had hired his own title researcher. This was apparently not at the board's direction, but on Strauss's personal initiative. He had been troubled by the demand letter's reference to the appurtenance agreement and had wanted to understand what it meant. His researcher had found the document and its significance within a week. Strauss had forwarded it to Diane by email with a subject line that read, "We may have a more serious problem than we thought." Diane had not disclosed the email to the full board. She had not disclosed it to the homeowners. She had authorized continued legal resistance at the community's expense, ultimately totaling $41,000 in attorney's fees, while knowing, based on that email, that my legal position was substantially stronger than Garrett had led the board to believe. Kevin Strauss, to his credit, disclosed the email himself during the civil discovery process. He was the one who produced it. The finding from the county's governance review was narrow and precise. The HOA president had failed to disclose material information to the board of directors relevant to the HOA's legal and financial exposure. She had authorized expenditure of HOA funds in excess of the board's approved legal budget without full board vote, in violation of the HOA's own bylaws. The finding was referred to the state's Homeowners Association Regulatory Office for review. Diane Holloway resigned as HOA president on a January morning in a 3-sentence letter to the board that contained the words, "for personal reasons," and nothing more. I read about it in the county paper. She had not spoken to me again after the morning she came to my workshop. Phil Delaney resigned 1 week later. Kevin Strauss, the board member who had found the appurtenance agreement and tried to disclose it, was elected HOA president at a special meeting in February. The first thing he did was commission an independent audit of the HOA's finances and governance practices. The second thing he did was send a letter to all 47 homeowners acknowledging that the drainage dispute had been mishandled by the previous leadership and outlining the terms of the resolution. He did not call me. I didn't expect him to. The resolution was documented. The relationship was defined by the easement agreement. There was nothing more to say. Hendricks and Associates received a formal notice of potential professional liability from the HOA for the engineering omissions that had created the situation. Whether that went anywhere in terms of litigation, I don't know, and I didn't follow it. That was their business. The two homeowners who had filed the civil action settled with the HOA for amounts that were not publicly disclosed. The HOA's insurance carrier paid out on the flood damage claims, then raised the HOA's premiums substantially, another cost the community had not anticipated when the board chose legal resistance over negotiation. For my own part, I used a portion of the easement payment for several things I had been putting off. I replaced the rotted fence sections in my lower field with a proper cedar post and rail installation. I had the lower field professionally regraded to restore the drainage patterns that 3 years of unauthorized overloading had disrupted. I installed a small monitoring station on the drainage channel, a simple data logger that records water levels and flow rates continuously, transmitting to my laptop. If the HOA ever violates the terms of the easement, I will know it the same day. I also had the appurtenance agreement scanned at high resolution, filed with the county recorder as a prominent primary document on my property. Title: not an attachment, not a footnote, but a standalone recorded document referenced directly in the deed description. No future engineer, developer, or HOA will overlook it. It is impossible to miss. Marcus Webb came by on a Saturday in early spring, a few months after everything was settled. We walked the property together the way you walk a place after something has happened in it. Slower than normal, more attentive, noticing things you might have passed without seeing before. We stopped at the Floodgate structure. It was clean now. Ray's crew had come back in the fall and cut the vegetation back properly, pressure washed the concrete, touched up a few surface cracks with hydrolite. The two gates sat in the open position, the channel running clear and quiet between them. It looked, I thought, the way a properly maintained piece of infrastructure is supposed to look: functional, honest, unambiguous about what it is. Marcus stood there for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the water move through. "You know," he said, "I've been doing this work for a long time. Drainage disputes, easement fights, water rights cases. I've seen a lot of them. How does this one compare?" I asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "Top 3, he said finally. "Maybe the best documented one I've ever been part of." I laughed. It felt good to laugh. It had been a long several months. We shook hands at the gate structure and he walked back to his truck, and I stood there for a while longer listening to the channel, watching the water run clear and level through the open gates, the hollow filling quietly in the low ground below. My lower field was dry. The regraded surface was holding. The new fence posts standing straight in solid ground. The mare who had pulled up lame was out in the upper pasture, moving well, completely recovered. The orchard at the east end of the property was showing the first green of the season. The old apple trees putting out the same tentative buds they put out every year, indifferent to everything that had happened around them. They had built their system on the assumption that I would never look too closely at what I owned. They had engineered 47 homes worth of stormwater dependency onto my land and never said a word. They had dismissed my first complaint with practiced condescension. They had sent attorneys to threaten injunctions. They had come to my workshop with speeches about innocent families as though the people who had built this situation on false premises were the ones deserving of protection. But I had looked closely. I had gone to the county recorder's office and sat with Gerald for 3 days. I had found a 60-year-old appurtenance agreement on a deed that everyone else had overlooked for decades. I had hired an engineer and an attorney and built a documentation record that was, as Marcus had said, the best he had ever been part of. And then I had waited. I had given formal notice. I had gone to court and won. And then I had simply exercised my rights, methodically, legally, on the record, in the rain. The flood was not my act of vengeance. It was the consequence of choices they had made. The choice to build without proper authorization, the choice to dismiss rather than negotiate, the choice to fight rather than settle. The choice, Diane's choice, specifically, to hide material information from her own community when honesty might still have saved them. Every consequence that followed was the product of those choices. I simply declined to absorb them. The floodgates had always been mine. They just never looked. Have you ever had a neighbor, a board member, or an entire HOA try to push their rules a little too far? Maybe even onto your own property? Drop your story down in the comments. Seriously, I read every single one, and I reply to as many as I can. Some of the wildest HOA stories I've seen actually come from viewers right here in the comments. And if you enjoy these kinds of real property disputes, HOA conflicts, and the moments when someone finally stands up and pushes back, make sure you subscribe. There are plenty more stories like this coming, because sometimes the most unbelievable battles don't happen in courtrooms. They happen right next door.